Hey guys, what's up? MiataMods here. In this video I'm going to show you how you can replace your rear brake pads and rear brake rotors. So, stay tuned. I already have a video on how to replace the front brake pads and rotors, and if you want to check that video out, click here. Now I'm not sure how long ago the rear brake pads and rotors have been replaced, so that's a job I'm going to tackle today. Before we start this job, loosen the lug nuts of the back wheels. Now I've got the car on the lift, but that's not really necessary. So if you're going to use a jack, you can place that either underneath the diff, or you can use the reinforced part of the pinch welds on either side. Don't forget to use a jack stand and leave the jack as a backup. Be safe, guys. Once the car is up in the air, remove the lug nuts and the back wheel. Alright, so this is the rear brake caliper which we're going to remove. This is the brake line and this is the handbrake bracket and line. Start by spraying some penetrating oil on all the bolts at the back and let it sit for a couple of minutes. This will make removing the bolts a little bit easier. While you wait for the penetrating oil to do its job, make sure the handbrake is not engaged and loosen the brake fluid reservoir cap so the fluid has somewhere to go when you compress the piston. Get a socket wrench and a 14mm socket to remove that bolt on the back side of the caliper. You can use an extension to make your job a little bit easier. Inside this hole is an Allen key, and for that you're going to need a 4mm Allen wrench. Unscrewing this Allen key is going to retract the caliper piston. This is important to understand, because to retract the caliper piston at the front you need a big C-clamp, but that's not needed for the backside. In fact, using a C-clamp to retract the back caliper piston will damage the gears in the caliper, so always use an Allen key. Remove the Allen key completely and inspect the threads. Whatever you do, don't lose this part. Now if you're watching this video and the piston is not moving but the Allen key is, then the teeth are probably stripped because of a seized piston. Unfortunately, the only solution for this is buying a new caliper. Luckily, they're not that expensive. I was not sure if my cover bolt had a copper washer, so I cleaned it up a bit, and as you can see, it does have a copper washer, but it seized on there, but that's not a problem. But if your cover bolt does not have a copper washer, I have a whole collection of copper washers, and I found out that this is the correct one, as you can see here. So that's the one you should get, and the measurements are as follows. So it has a outer diameter of 14mm and it has a inner diameter of 10mm. Next up is this 10mm lower guide pin bolt at the bottom. Sometimes there is a dust cap on it, which you can just pull off the bolt if it wants to do that. There we go. It's too slippery, so I can't get it out, so I'm going to clean this. There we go. After you remove the bolt, you can pivot the caliper upwards. If you just want to replace the pads, this is the way to do it, and as you can see, it's really easy. Remove the clips, spring tensioner and the old brake pads. To remove the caliper, just slide it upwards and then slide it towards the car. And there we go. Be sure to use a bungee cord or zip tie to hang your caliper on something. Don't just place it somewhere, because when it falls down it will damage your brake lines. This is also a good time to inspect the caliper, especially the rubbers. You can use some brake cleaner to clean the caliper, so it's easier to spot a problem with your caliper. The rubbers look good, no tears, and the piston, well, it's a bit rusted, but other than that I don't see any problems. Now if you want, you can remove the caliper bracket as well, but as you can see it clears the rotor, so no need to remove that. Removing it is pretty easy. You just have to remove two 40mm bolts at the back. Now we can remove the old brake pad, the clips and the spring tensioner, and last but not least the rotor. And as you can see, mine is already loose. But if it's stuck, you can either use a big hammer and then hammer it on the face of the rotor from the front and the back to hammer it free, or you can use an old 8mm bolt and you can use this hole and you can insert the bolt, and then you will get your socket wrench and a socket, put it on here, and if you start twisting you push on the face of the hub and then it will break the rotor free, because it's pushing on the inside of the hub. Now that everything is removed, we need to clean a few parts, starting with the slider pin of the caliper bracket. I'm going to use some brake cleaner and a paper towel to remove all the old grease. Now make sure that the surface of the slider pin is smooth. If not, you can use some sandpaper to smooth out the surface. The surface is smooth, so I'm going to reapply some high temperature grease. I'm going to do the same with the slider bolt that I removed earlier. I'm going to use some sandpaper to smooth down the surface. Alright, well, that surface is nice and smooth again. Let's not forget the Allen key, which is pretty gunked up, so I'm going to clean that one as well. Much better. And last but not least, the hub. I'm going to use some brake cleaner, paper towels and a wire brush to clean the surface. Now I'm going to reapply some grease to the hub so the rotor will not stick to the hub. You can use copper grease or any other type of grease as long as it is high temperature grease. To keep the rotors from rusting, they add a coat of oil. If you do not remove that oil before mounting the rotors, the first few times you will brake, you will not have enough stopping power. So it's important to clean the rotor with some brake cleaner before you install them on the car. Install the new rotor. If you want, you can add a lug nut to keep the rotor in place. Before we install the brake pads, you need to install the clips. You can reuse the old clips, but I got some new ones. Add some high temperature grease on the installment points and then install them. That's one and that's two. And make sure you don't get any grease on the brake pad surface. I'm also going to add some grease to the back side of the pad itself, so it won't stick to the caliper. Now we can add the tensioner. If you don't have the tensioner, you need to buy it, because it will make sure that there's always a bit of room between the brake pads and the brake rotor. Keep the pads nicely against the rotor. Slide it in between one of the endings of the pad, you have a small hole right along here. I hope you guys can see it. And I'm going to slide it over this pin. And then with a little bit of force, it goes in the hole on the other end, and that will push the pads a bit away from the rotor. Alright, so next up is the caliper itself. I already cut it loose because it was zip tied to the spring. And before I continue this job, I wanted to mention that I used the old tensioner to install it on the top here. For some reason, when I removed everything, there was only a tensioner at the bottom, and with the kit there was only one tensioner provided. I'm not really sure why, because it feels logical to have a tensioner on the top and the bottom. So I reused the old one and installed it at the top. So now it moves on the top and the bottom. I think that's better. So I got the caliper, but I noticed something problematic, and that is that the piston is not all the way in. And that's a bit weird, because when you turn the Allen key all the way to the left, the piston should be retracted all the way alongside the rubber, and that did not happen. So what I did was get the key, I inserted it into the hole, and then I started twisting the Allen key. And what should happen is you would see the piston move, but it's not moving. So I've come to the conclusion that this caliper is seized, and that's not uncommon on these cars. So for the sake of this video, I'm just going to continue installing the caliper, and hopefully it will fit over the new thicker pads. Let's see, this is all greased up. So next step will be to slide the caliper onto this bracket, and it is a bit hard because of the parking brake line. And there we go. And then we need to slide it over the pads. So let's see if I can get them close enough. Ah, there we go. So that's it. So I will continue with this video, but eventually I have to replace this caliper. Alright, so now we can reinstall the lower guide pin bolt. First I'm going to clean it once more, and then I'm going to add some high temperature grease. There we go. Make sure that this rubber is not caught between the caliper and the bracket. And it looks like it's in the right place, so now I can reinstall the slider pin, and then get your 10mm socket and a socket wrench. And unfortunately the parking brake is a bit in the way, but this should work fine. You need to tighten this to 27 foot-pounds or 37 Newton meters. Alright, so the rotor is reinstalled, the pads are reinstalled, the clips are reinstalled, and the tensioners are reinstalled. The caliper itself is reinstalled. We reinstalled this bolt, and the final thing is the Allen key. Now again, my caliper seems to be seized, but I'm just going to pretend it's working correctly and talk you through the rest of the process. So with this Allen key, you can readjust the piston of the caliper. Now in the beginning of the video I explained that you can use the Allen key to retract the caliper piston all the way back into the caliper. I would suggest that you first get a feeling on how it feels when the hub is completely free to spin around. So when you are adjusting the caliper piston with the Allen key, you can feel when the caliper is locking up the rotor. So this is moving freely, and of course this can be a bit heavy because you're not only moving the rotor but also moving the diff and the drive shaft. So of course this will not spin as freely as the front wheels, but this is a good indication of how freely it should spin with the caliper piston all the way back into the caliper. Now get your Allen key, add some high temperature grease before you reinstall it into the caliper, and then reinstall it in the caliper at the back. So now I'm going to reinstall the Allen key, and then I'm going to turn it clockwise. So lefty loosey, righty tighty. I'm going to tighten it all the way, and I'm really curious if it will lock up the rotor. Okay, so that's tight. Let's see. I can't move the rotor. So I guess the piston is still moving somewhat. Now normally you would back it off a third of a turn so you can move the hub again. You don't want to leave your pads rubbing on the rotor, so if you still can move it, back it off a little bit more. So my piston is kinda locked up, so I'm not sure if a third of a turn will be sufficient, but let's see. So a third of a turn, and let's see if we can move the hub. Yeah, you can move the hub, but it's really hard to turn it, so I'll back it off a bit more. Now it's moving freely. Then I'll tighten it a bit more. Let's see when it locks up. Yeah. Now it locks up. Well, I can still move it. Now it locks up. So a third of a turn counterclockwise. Yeah, that's about it. Now I'm going to pull the handbrake to see if it locks up the hub again. Here we go. Yep, that's not moving. So that's a good sign. And it's moving again. Okay. If it doesn't lock up, you need to tighten the Allen key on the back a bit more and then retry the handbrake. Now you can refit that cover bolt which covers the Allen key. Add some high temperature grease to the threads and reinstall it. Tighten it to 10 foot-pounds or 14 Newton meters. Don't forget to reinstall that dust cap. It's best to degrease the rotor one last time to remove all the contaminants. This side is now done, so you can reinstall the wheel and do the other side. Yeah, that went perfectly. So all the way to the right to tighten it, then a third to like a half of a turn to the left to loosen it, and now it's moving freely. So this caliper is working A-okay. Alright guys, well the other side is done and the caliper on that side is working correctly. So I got two clips showing the difference. One clip is when I turned the Allen key all the way to the left and all the way to the right, and then the difference of the caliper cylinder, and you can clearly see a difference on the position of the caliper piston. So that's the first clip, and I got a second clip of the caliper sitting on top of the rotor and showing you that you can still move it from side to side when the Allen key is all the way to the left. So the caliper piston is all the way inside the caliper, and if you have the piston in that position, you should still be able to move the caliper from side to side. So that's the second clip. So those were the clips of the caliper working correctly. So I guess my next video will be replacing the caliper. That's fine, they're not that expensive. I am debating on rebuilding the caliper, but I guess a new caliper is not so expensive. So I think I'm just going to buy a new caliper. It's easier. I don't have a lot of time. So people who don't have a lot of time, I would suggest just buying a new caliper and just get it over with. So I guess that will be my next video. Alright, to finish the job, press your brake pedal a few times to reseat the brake pads. Also check your brake fluid level one last time, and don't forget to put the cap back on the brake fluid reservoir. Also, when you reinstall the wheels and your car is back on the ground, retighten your lug nuts. The final step is to brake in the new pads and rotors. Now the instructions vary, but I would recommend doing 5 to 10 stops with medium brake pressure from about 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers per hour. That will make sure that your brakes will be performing up to par. And that's it guys. Just so you know, the procedure is roughly the same for the NB model, so if you own that model, you can follow this guide as well. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Tot de volgende keer. From the rear. Oes. Die. Nee, het is niet die. Holy shit. Keeping track of all my shit. Hallo. Oh joh. Goddamn vliegtuigen.